great time, especially for gaming. It was a time of rapid progression in video games, going from the 8-bit era to the 16-bit era, all the way to the 32-bit era and beyond. However, today we're here to focus on one of Nintendo's biggest rivals of the era, Sega. More specifically, the Sega Genesis. The Genesis was one of the few consoles in the late 80s to mid 90s to give Nintendo a heavy run for its money. Boasting blast processing and catchy slogans like Sega does what Nintendo don't, it was obvious from the start that Sega wanted a piece of Nintendo and fully intended to get it. This kind of aggressive campaign was mostly the brainchild of one person, Tom Kalinske, who decided to take Nintendo head-on, bucking the traditional, more reserved approach that most Japanese companies had at the time. He outlined a 5-step battle plan that they would use to take on the massive video game giant. Step 1. Lower the price. First off, he wanted to hit Nintendo where it hurt, the cost of the console. Not only did the Genesis have a lead moving into the 16-bit era, having come out sooner, Tom wanted to make sure they kept that lead. That meant lowering the price below what Nintendo was going to offer with the Super Nintendo. So they dropped the price almost exactly when the Super Nintendo came out. This was followed by an aggressive marketing campaign to show the high value of the system versus the cost of Nintendo's offering. This worked early on, with people being eager to snap up the console because it was $50 less than Nintendo's Super Nintendo system. Couple this with a year lead meant the system was not only cheaper, but it had more games right out the gate and cost less than the Super Nintendo's offering. Sega Genesis games were also a little bit cheaper. They averaged $50, whereas the average Super Nintendo game would cost $60 all the way upwards to $80 per game. All of this was designed to directly target Nintendo and keep the console lead firmly in Sega's favor. Number 2. Defeat Mario. This was really swinging for the fences. Now imagine yourself being new to Sega, and not only that, an American, facing down Japanese leadership, and just having a goal to go, we're gonna take down Mario. I don't know that I would have had the stomach to do it, but here was Tom outlining a plan to do just that. The idea was simple. Come up with a mascot specifically designed to be, well, anti-Mario. The idea of a hedgehog was, interestingly enough, picked by New Yorkers. That's right, Naoto Oshima took some eternal designs and showed them to random passers-by in Central Park to get their opinion on which they liked best, and in the end, they picked the one that would eventually become Sonic. They detailed out the design by keeping a few things in mind. First, they wanted it to be easily drawn by children and be familiar and exhibit a cool attitude. The color itself was cobalt blue in order to symbolize the Sega logo itself. His shoes were a nod to Michael Jackson's boots, and the color meant to be a stark contrast to those same boots and be reminiscent of Santa. If you look closely, even some of Sonic's poses are a throwback to Michael Jackson's Bad album. The hard work paid off, because Sonic is just as well known in this era of gaming as the plucky plumber was, and is in many ways as fondly remembered today. Number 3. More sports. One of the things that they wanted to do in order to try to make the system appeal to a wider audience, Sega was going to invest more in sports games. Not just generic sports games, but getting licenses from the NFL, NHL, and NBA, to name just a few. While not being the first to get licenses from these brands, that particular feather goes in a television's cap. They were the most successful so far, even setting up a Sega sports brand with developers to make games as yearly entries. This allowed them to adjust the rosters, tweak the gameplay each year to match the team's current roster and strength. The developers worked under this umbrella until around 2003, when Visual Concepts and Take-Two Interactive would be sold to start producing games under the 2K branding. Even Madden got its start on the Genesis before eventually getting ported over to the Super Nintendo. This helped solidify Sega's image as being cool or hip, as sports games had a larger appeal to most people than video games at the time. It began to draw an older and more diverse crowd to the system as a result. They didn't just do licensed games. Games like Mutant League Football got its start on the system, helping the Genesis have the bad boy/adult image that they were going for. Looking back on it now, it's obvious that in many ways, that Sega was responsible for the billion-dollar sports game industry that exists today. Number 4. Cool for teens. Many of the above things were designed to make the console seem more interesting to the older crowd, from Sonic's irreverent attitude to all the sports games that were part of the system. Not only that, they would do some things that Nintendo wouldn't do. Mortal Kombat was a prime example of this. Nintendo insisted that blood not be shown on the report of Mortal Kombat. whereas the Genesis had no such restrictions. So, when it came to their console, it was seen in its full bloody glory. This was actually a way it hurt Nintendo so badly in sales and in image that when Mortal Kombat 2 came out, Nintendo revoked their no blood policy and the game was represented far more accurately. It was clear at this point that Sega was starting to get under Nintendo's skin. This, coupled with their ability to pump out games that would not only appeal to teenagers, like Earthworm Jim, Streets of Rage, Game Ground, and Shinobi, they were also very good at putting out kid-friendly games, like Sonic, Rocket Knight, Chameleon Kid, and Atomic Robo Kid. This gave them a lot more diversity, more so than Nintendo had, and began helping them pull ahead in the gaming industry. Even Sega's own marketing campaign during the time was designed to appeal to older crowds and convince them that the system and video games were cool, further diversifying and expanding the crowd of people that would play video games. Number 5. Make fun of Nintendo. This one goes without saying. Sega always took every opportunity they could to take a dig at Nintendo, something that really had not been done since the Television and Atari days. To do this, they set up focus groups. These were intended to watch teens play games so that they could better understand their target age group of 10 to 14. What they found is most were unhappy with Nintendo at the time and thought Sega had a better product with the Genesis. They took this information back to Sega, where the head researcher, Arana Hayaki, stated, "Okay, if we're gonna do this, now's the time to do it. Nintendo's starting to react." So, Goodby Berlin and Silverstein worked with their creative department, coming back with a campaign that portrayed the parents as clueless to video games. Sega liked the ads, but wanted more gameplay in them. They didn't really have any in there at the time. So, the company went back to the drawing board, coming back with their pitch. Setting up like a rock concert with towering speakers and screens, the executives were blown away and approved the ad campaign, but not the $10 million. Oh no, they were going in big, putting in $65 million in 1992. The campaign hit 2 goals: establish Sega as the coolest brand for ages 10 to 14, widen the customer range from 10 to 14 years old to 10 to 27 years old. The campaign worked. They started outselling Nintendo, portraying Mario as a product of yesterday, Nintendo as a console for babies, while Sega was the hip new thing. And at the end of each commercial was the iconic scream, "Sega!" That iconic scream, as it turns out, was almost an afterthought. While they were shooting a commercial in 1992, one of the workers popped up and said, "Hey, why don't you guys just scream Sega at the end?" They decided to try it. The staff editor at the time, Jimbo Madsen, recorded it. Tom saw it and loved it. And from there on, it became a running theme and a major part of Sega's identity during this time period. It was so popular that when they released a Talking Sonic plush in later years, one of its lines would scream Sega when squeezed. It was such an effective campaign, you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone who grew up around this time who won't scream Sega, if only in their heads. Admit it, you're doing it right now. They also hired influencers on college campuses, touting the console to those crowds, along with showing up in malls to tout the system as well. All this made Sega a true competitor to Nintendo. Sega kept up their advantage, allowing more and more types of games with less rigorous testing on their platform. This led to some less refined games, but some real gems as well. Sega would also launch the Sega CD to flex the system more. While not the first to work on such an add-on, it was one of the more popular ones at the time, ushering in larger games and FMV games like Night Trap, which was the subject of a congressional hearing in 1993, which most would think would cause issues for the console, but it fit right in with the irreverent attitude the console was trying to garner, and gained far more interest in not only the Genesis, but the CD add-on as well. They would even go on to market the 32X to extend the life of the console. In the end, they wouldn't outsell the SNES, but they had come the closest, showing that Nintendo could be competed with successfully through clever marketing, hard work, and tenacity. They sold 29.1 million units versus Nintendo's 49.1 million units. This was impressive, given that they'd only sold 13 million Master System units, next to 62 million NES units in the previous generation. What was even more interesting is that they sold over half of those units in the United States, where sales marketing campaign was the most aggressive. They also changed the marketing dynamic and age range of games forever, remaking the face and image of the gaming industry and helping in many ways to set in place the industry that we know and love today. I hope you enjoyed this video of how Sega took on Nintendo and pushed them to the very end. showing us a competition unlike any that we've seen since the days of Atari. It was an exciting time, full of promise and many new IPs, and it was my absolute pleasure to share it with you. Now I'd like to ask you for a favor. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, and if you find you like more of my content, please hit the subscribe button and the notify bell. That way you know when I post new content. However, for now, I hope to see you again, and until next time, happy gaming.